Chapter 16. Out of the Darkness. There was no measure of time for Ryder in that walled coffin of death. The seconds seemed hours, the minutes ages. He drew quick, short breaths, as if economizing the air that was so soon to fail him. He tugged at his bonds till the veins rose on his forehead, but the silk held, and the confines of the prison permitted him no room for struggle. Then he leaned forward, to press with all his might upon the bricks before him. He grunted, he sweated with the agony of his exertions, but not a brick was stirred, not a crack was made in the mortar that gripped them tighter every instant. He died 1,000 deaths in the horror that invaded him then. Already he felt strangling, and the painful pumping of his heart seemed the beginning of the end. Cold sweat stood out all over him. It ran down his face in trickling streams, and his body was drenched with that clammy dew of fear. He tried to count the minutes, the hours, to estimate how long he would hold out. And then he heard his own voice saying very distinctly and clearly and dispassionately, "This thing is absurd." It was absurd. It was idiotic. It was utterly irrational. It was an impossible end for an able-bodied young American, an excavator of no mean attainments, a young scholar and explorer of 20th-century science, a sane, modern, harmless young man, to die immured in the ancient walls of a Turkish palace because he had invaded a marriage reception and intervened between man and wife. Violent death in any form must always appear absurd to the young and energetic, but the fantastic horror of his death removed it definitely from any realm of possibility. The thing simply could not happen. He thought of the amazement and the incredulity of his friends. Dangers in plenty they had warned him against, to his youthful amusement, sandstorms, and chills, and raw fruit, and unboiled waters, but they had not warned him against veiled women and the resentments of outraged lords and masters. He thought of his mother's consternation and dismay. He thought of his father's stern amazement. What an awful jolt it would give them, he reflected, with an irrational tickling of young humor. But no, it would not. They would never know. Not a word of this fate would percolate into the world without. Not a comment upon his true end would enliven the daily columns of the East Middleton Monitor. Never would it regret the tragic and romantic interment of a young native son of talent, buried alive by a revengeful general of the Sultan. He amused himself by writing the paragraph that would never be written. Then he told himself that he was light-headed and hysterical, and that he had better wonder what would actually be written, what explanation would be found. A desert storm, perhaps, or some accident. McLean would poke about, but for all McLean knew he might be on his way back to camp that very moment. And sometimes he went by sailing canoe and a rented horse, and sometimes by the accredited steamer and a camel, and sometimes by tram or train to the nearest station. Even McLean's mind and McLean's copse wouldn't make much of all the alternatives that his unsettled habits had afforded. Was there any possibility of his being traced, of any rescue reaching him? He thought hard and long upon his last free moments. Jinny Jeffries knew that he was in the palace, and Jinny had been reiteratedly warned about the danger of betraying that knowledge. It would take some little time for alarm before Jinny said anything, and it would take a little time for Jinny to begin to worry. He had not been so instant in attendance upon Jinny of late, for all their residence in the same hotel, that she would suspect that his absence of 24 hours was due to actual incarceration. His cursed passion for freedom in which to ramble up and down that deserted lane without Tewfik Pasha's garden, his inane love of solitary mooning. No, Jinny would not soon wonder about him. She had not expected to see him that evening anyway. He had muttered something to her about a man and an engagement. She would rather look to see him the next day and talk about their adventure, but still she would feel no more than pique at his absence. Positive worry would not develop until later. Besides, all the revelations that Jinny could make would do no good. Jinny could only report that he had maintained a disguise at a wedding reception, and talked a few moments, apparently undetected, to a bride. Hamdi Bey and Hamdi's eunuchs would be blandly ignorant of such a scandal. What his disappearance would indicate would be some further frolic on his part, some tempting of a later providence before he had abandoned his disguise, if he were discovered, for instance, in some of those native quarters behind a woman's veil. Decidedly the only effect of Jinny's revelations would be an unsavory cloud upon his character. There was no hope to be looked for. And yet he could not believe it. There were moments when the black terror mastered him, but involuntarily his young strength shook it off. He could not believe in its reality. He could not believe that he was actually here, bricked and bound in this infernal coffin. But indisputably the evidence was in favor of belief. Only to believe was to feel again that horror. He tried to tell himself that it didn't matter. One had to die sometime. Everybody did. One might as well go out young and strong and still interested in life. But that was remarkably cold comfort. He didn't want to go out at all. He didn't want to die, not for 50 or 60 years yet, and of all the ways of dying, he wanted least to smother and choke and stifle like a rat walled in its hole in the wall. He recalled with peculiar pain a woodchuck that he had penned up as a boy, and he hoped with extraordinary passion that the poor beast had made another hole. Never again, he resolved, would he pen up a living creature, never again, if only again he could see the light of day and breathe the free air. He thought of Aimée, and when he thought of her his heart seemed to turn to water. Useless to repeat to himself now those old reminders that he had seen her so little, known her so slightly. Useless to measure that strange feeling that drew him by any artifice of time and acquaintance. She was Aimée. She was enchantment and delight. She was appeal and tenderness. She was blind longing and mystery. She was beauty and desire. Even to think of her now, in the infernal horror of this cramping grave, was to feel his heart quicken and his blood grow hot in a helpless passion of dread and fear. She was alone there, helpless, with that madman. He tried to tell himself that she was not wholly helpless, that she had wit and spirit and courage, and that somehow she would manage to quell the storm. She might persuade Hamdi to their story, make him remember that this was the 20th century, wherein one does not go about immuring inconvenient trespassers as in the earlier days of the mad Khedive, years which had probably formed the general's impulses. But in telling himself this there was no comfort for the thought of the price that Aimée would have to pay. It was pleasanter to pretend that Hamdi was really only joking, in a shockingly exaggerated, practical way, and that presently, when the suitable time had elapsed, he would present himself, smiling, to end the ghastly, antiquated jest. For some time he continued to tell himself that. And then suddenly he told himself that the time for intervention had surely come. It was very hard to breathe. The next minute he was assuring himself that this was merely some devil's trick of his apprehensive imagination. There must be a great deal of air left. But he was distressingly ignorant of the contents of air, and his calculations were lamentably unsupported by any sound basis of fact. Mistake not to have gone in for chemistry and physics. A chap who'd done time in those subjects wouldn't now be rocking with suspense. He'd comfortably and satisfactorily know just how many hours, minutes, and seconds were allotted before his finish, and he could think his thoughts accordingly. Undoubtedly, so he insisted to himself, there was air enough here to last him till morning. This gasping stuff was all imagination. He wanted to keep cool and quiet, but for all his reassurance there was something a little queer with his lungs, and his heart was lurching sickeningly in his side like a runaway ship's engine. And then he heard his own voice repeating very tonelessly, "Oh God, oh God," and the horror of it all came blackly over him, and a feeling of profound and awful sickness. It was a sound. The faintest scraping and knocking without that wall. It went through him like an electric current, and then a roar burst from him that fairly split his ears, the reaction of his quivered nerves and racking fears of his uncertainties, his tightening terrors. But now nothing. He could not hear a thing. A delusion? A torture of his final hours? No, it came again. More definitely now, a little grinding and scraping. Faster and faster, a muffled, driving thud. A jubilant reassurance sang gaily through him. He had expected this. This was what he had predicted. Hamdi was no foul friend. He was a devilish, uncomfortable customer with antiquated notions of revenge, but now he had shot his wad and was going to undo his tricks. Ryder braced himself to present a carefree jauntiness, an air somewhat difficult to assume when one is trussed like a spitted bird in a hot coffin space, with hair falling dankly over a steaming brow, with a collar like a string, and an indescribable pallor beneath the bronze of one's face. Something stirred. One end of a brick was driven in against his chest. Then he felt the blind working of some tool that caught it and worried it free. It seemed to him that through the dark aperture a current of cold, delicious air came rushing in about him. The blows sounded against the adjoining bricks, and he thought of the glorious joy of seeing out again, feeling that he would welcome even the sight of Hamdi's blond mustache and the eunuch's hideous grin. Now the aperture emitted a pale gleam upon his chest. Staring steadily down, he caught a glimpse of the fingers curving about a brick, and his heart that had steadied began to race again wildly, for they were not the fingers of the black, nor yet the wiry joints of the general. They were soft, white fingers with a gleam of rings. Aimée! Somehow, somewhere, she had managed to come to him, to achieve this rescue. Aimée! He breathed the name. Shh! Came a warning little whisper, and impatiently he waited until that opening should be greater and permit of sight and speech. His helplessness was maddening. If only he could raise his hands, could get those bonds off. He twisted, he writhed, he tried to lift his elbows and get his wrists in reach of the opening, but the coffin was too diabolically cramped for movement until the hole was very much larger. Then, with a convulsive pressure, he swung his wrists within reach, and after a moment's wait he felt a thin blade drawn across the silk. The relief was glorious. He swung his hands free, rubbing the chafed wrists, then thrust an open hand out into the opening, and with an instant comprehension, a short, pointed bit of iron was put within it. Now he could do something. With furious strength he attacked the bricks edging the hole, and as he pried free each brick he could again get a glimpse of those white, delicate fingers lifting it carefully away. And now the hole was large enough. He twisted about and thrust out a leg, and then, with a feeling of ecstasy which made the official literary raptures of saints and conquerors but pale, dim moods, he wormed his way out of that jagged hole and turned, erect and free, to the shrouded figure of his rescuer. She had drawn back a little against the wall, a gauzy veil across her face. Beside her, upon the stone floor, a solitary candle sent its flickering rays into the shadows, edging with light her slender outlines. Ryder took one quick step to her, his heart in his throat, and put out eager arms. But in the very moment that he was gathering her to him, even when he felt her pliant body, at first resistant, then softly yielding, swept against his own, he felt, too, a little palm suddenly upon his mouth. "Hush!" said the soft whispering voice, cutting into his low murmur of "Aimée!" And then, in slow, emphatic caution, "Be careful!" He had need of that caution, for under the saffron veil was not the face of Aimée. He was clasping a young creature that he had never seen before, a girl with flaming henna hair and coal-darkened brows, a vivid, blazoning face that smiled enigmatically with a certain mockery of delight at the amazement he reflected so unguardedly. Chapter 17. Aziza. From the slackening grip of his astounded arms she stepped backward, still smiling faintly and holding up in admonishment the palm she had pressed against his mouth. "But what the muttered Ryder. She nodded mysteriously and beckoned. "Come," she whispered, catching up her candle, and after holding it high for a moment, staring at him, she extinguished it suddenly and turned to lead the cautious way across the stone spaces while Ryder closely followed. Not Aimée, then, but some messenger, he could only suppose, some confidant at need, a handmaid? The whisper of her silks, the remembered gleam of jewels in the henna hair, flouted that thought, and not troubling his ingenuity with alternatives, he was content to follow her swift steps. They were now in those open, rubbishy spaces where he remembered the crumbling masonry and broken arches of old disregarded mosques. Now they were again enclosed in narrow stone walls, winding past cellars and storerooms. The girl's advance grew more cautious. Often she stopped and listened, peering ahead into the darkness, and now, as she took another turning, her care redoubled, and Ryder needed no exhortation to imitate it. Obeying a gesture of her arm, he followed at a greater distance, prepared, at the warning of a sound, to flatten himself against the wall or dart into some cranny of retreat. They were now in the cellars. The corridor was widening out before them with a pallid showing of light, crossed with many bars at some far end. They stole towards it. It was a window or barred gate, he saw, and he heard again that lapping of restless water against stone. He could see, too, in the dimness, the curve of a stair near the gate. Abruptly his guide checked him. Wary and noiseless, he waited, while she stole forward to those stairs, peering up into the gloom, attentive for any sound from above. Apparently satisfied, she went on towards the barred gate, and bent down over a spot of darkness which Ryder had taken for a shadow. He saw now that it had some semblance to a human outline. Closely the girl bent, and he caught the pallor of her hands, searching swiftly, and then a muffled clink. Next moment, a wraith with soundless steps, she was back at his side again, urging him on with her. They passed the stairs. He felt the soft yield of carpet beneath his feet. They passed that recumbent figure, and now he heard the rhythm of a sleeper's heavy breath, escaping muffledly from the folds of a thick mantle which the sleeper's habits had wrapped about his head. For all the mantle, he was aware of the fumes of wine. "I saw that Ja'afar had his drink," said the girl suddenly, in soft whispered Turkish, her head close to his. "He is my friend. I do not neglect him." And under her breath she laughed, as she exhibited the great bunch of keys she had taken from the imbiber. Stooping now before the gate, she fitted the key into the lock. Then over her shoulder she looked up at the young man, and asked him a quick question. He did not understand. That was the trouble with his vernacular. It would go on very well for a time, when he had a clue to the sense, or when it was a question of everyday expression. But a sudden divergence, an unexpected word, was apt to prove a hopeless obstacle. Now she repeated her question again, more slowly, and again he shook his head. Now she stood up, frowning a little, and began again in English. "You no, I not know. This way? You do it?" A sudden smile broke over her face as she made a swift pushing gesture with her hands, that, with her pointing to the water outside, sent Ryder a sudden enlightenment. "Swim? You mean do I swim?" She nodded. "Not go." She made a swift downward movement of her hands, and then pointed again to that water just outside the gate. "Not go down, not sink?" interpreted Ryder. "No, indeed, I can swim," he assured her, and revisited with smiling satisfaction, she knelt again before the barred gate. Open it swung with so sharp a crack that both glanced at the figure behind them, and then at the shadowy gloom of the stairs. But no alarm sounded. Outside the gate Ryder saw the darkness of fairly wide rippling waters, visited with floating stars, and beyond a low-lying, dun bank. Escape was there. Freedom. Safety. He felt an exultant longing to plunge in and strike out, but he turned questioningly to the mysterious rescuer. "Aimée," he said under his breath, "where is she?" He repeated it in the vernacular, distrusting her English, and in the vernacular she answered, "You want her? You want to take her away with you?" She laughed softly at the quick flash in his eyes, and hardly waited for his speech. "Good, what a lover! You are not afraid?" Mendaciously he assured her that he was not. "Good," she said again, with a showing of white teeth between her carmined lips. "You take her. You take her away from him. That is what I want, you understand?" Very suddenly he understood. Chapter 18. Aziza is offended. This was no emissary from Aimée. This was no philanthropic bystander. This was some girl of the palace, jealous and daring, conspiring shrewdly for the removal of her rival. "Take her away," she was saying urgently, "out of this palace. We want no brides here." Lowering and sullen, she turned bitter on the word. "Tonight I was watching," she went on swiftly. "I heard the noise, and then the whispering. The darkness has ears and eyes and a tongue, and so I waited out there." He could not distinguish all the quick flow of her speech, but he caught enough to understand how she had lurked in the halls, jealously spying, defying the eunuch's authority, and how she had caught with passionate delight that stifled alarm of scandal. Later, hanging over some banister, she had seen the Ethiopian pass with his burden, and had stolen down afterwards, stalking like a cat, and had discovered the lantern gone, the door unlocked, and then she had watched until the pair emerged without the burden. She had not been able to get hold of the key to the door, but she had resolved to explore, and so she had furnished the waterman with his wine, drugged, Ryder gathered, and so stolen past him on the other route to those underground foundations to which her suspicions had been directed by the mortar and dust upon Yusuf. Evidently she knew the possibilities of the place, and the mind of its master, and when she found the old niche freshly bricked and mortar at hand, She had not needed more to assure her that here was the burial place of her rival's lover. Now, for the boon of his life, he was to relieve her of that rival, or try to. "For once, he might not kill her," she whispered, "but if again—" Her eyes glowed like a cat's in the dark. "Take her away. Make her name a spitting and a disgrace, her memory a shame and a sting. Is she beautiful?" she broke off to demand. "They say, but slaves lie." "Can you believe a lover?" he said whimsically for all his impatience. "She is a pearl, a rose, a crescent moon." "They say she is very pale and thin." "She is a houri from paradise," he said distinctly. "And now, in the name of Allah, let me get to her. Tell me the way." "Will she go gladly with you?" The low, insistent voice went on, and at his quick nod, "Holy Prophet, what a bride!" She clapped her two ringed hands to smother the impish joy of her laugh. "A warning to those who can be warned. He will not be so eager for another stripe from that same stick. It was his cousin, Saniha Hanam, Satan devour her, who made this marriage. Always she hated me. But now I will tell you how to get her. Look out, with me." Kneeling at the gate, over the dark flow of the water, she drew him down beside her, and thrusting out her veiled head, she pointed upward and to the right to a jutting balcony of mashrubiyeh, where a pale light showed through the fretwork. "There, you see? That is my room, and if you climb up, I can let you in. There, up," she repeated in English, resolved to make certain. "I see, I can get there," he assured her, measuring with his eye the dim distance. "At once," she said, "I will be there. I cannot take you with me through the upper hall. It is dangerous even for me to be caught. But no eunuch wants my displeasure." He could believe it, watching the subtle, malicious daring of her face. Even in the gloom he caught the steady-lidded arrogance of her coal-darkened eyes, and the bold insolence of a high cheekbone. She had a hint of gypsy. "And you can get me in? You're a wonder," he whispered. "I can't thank you enough." "Rid me of her," said the girl swiftly, "but not him. You must swear. What is it that Christians swear by?" she broke off to demand. "By the grave of your father? Yes. You will swear not to hurt him, to hurt Hamdi, by the grave of your father, yes?" Ryder nodded quickly. His father, to be sure, was in no grave at all. He was, allowing hastily for the difference in time, in his treasurer's cage at the bank in East Middleton, but he did not wait to explain this to the girl. "I swear it," he repeated. "I won't hurt your Hamdi, since that's your condition, but we're wasting time. Up, then, and if you fall down, do like this." Smiling mischievously, she made the gesture of swimming. "Allah go with thee, and with me also," he heard her murmur, as he stepped out to the ledge of the entrance, twisted himself agilely about, and climbing up the open gate, swung himself up to the stone carving overhead. Below him he heard the gate swing shut. He did not hear her lock it. Fervently he hoped she had not, since it was a possible exit for anyone in a hurry, but at any rate he need not worry about a way out of the place until he had got into it again. And the getting in was not any too simple. It was work for a mountain goat, he reflected, after a short interval devoted to tentative reaches and balancing and digging in of hands and feet. The distances were far greater than the first glimpse, foreshortened perspective, had allowed him to guess, and there was only the starlight to illumine the gray face of the palace. He had no idea of the time. Somewhere about the middle of the night or early morning, he judged vaguely by the stars, although it seemed impossible that so few hours had passed. The river was all silence and darkness. No nugars with their sleeping crews were moored below. He seemed the only living, breathing thing clambering across the face of time and space. Gingerly he kicked off the nondescript black shoes he had worn with his disguise that afternoon, and essayed a perilous toe-hold while he reached for the interstices of a mashrubiyeh window just overhead. Once gripping the rounds he pulled himself up, reflecting that it was night, and that no lady was sitting within her shelter to be affrighted at this intrusion of fingers and toes. From the jutting top of this projection he surveyed his further field of operation. The window with a light was 2 stories higher yet, and to the right. There were 2 other windows with lights on the 2nd story, very much farther along, and he wondered painfully if these were the rooms of Aimée. That boudoir in which he had hidden through the end of the long reception had been upon the water, and there had been a door into an adjoining room, for he had seen a sallow-faced attendant passing in and out. A wild longing seized him to crawl on and over into those windows. but it was a difficult, almost an impossible distance, and even when there he would be like a fly on the outside of a pane with no way of getting in. The unknown girl had promised him a way through her window, and he had confidence in her ingenuity and daring. So he went on, worming cautiously along old gutters and ledges and jutting balconies, until at last he was clasping the lower grille of that mashrubiyeh from which her light gleamed. Instantly the light went out. "Wait!" he heard her voice say sharply over his head. She was standing by the window, fumbling with the woodwork, and in a moment he heard the click of a knob, and then, just opposite his head, the screening grille slipped aside and an aperture appeared. "Quick!" admonished the voice, and quickly indeed he drew himself up and in, reflecting whimsically as he did so that this girl had first helped him out of a hole and then into one. The next moment she had moved the grille into place and lifted the cover she had placed over her triplet of candles on a stand. Triumphant, her eyes dancing, her teeth a gleam of light between those scarlet lips of hers, she looked at him for the admiration she saw twinkling back at her in his eyes. "But not me, no," she protested, her supple hands gesturing towards the magic casement. "I found it here. It is very old, you understand? Some other, long ago, found time dull, and so—" Delightedly she shared the flavor of that secret of the vagabond lady of long ago who had devised this cunning entrance for her lover. On some dark night like this, with the gatekeeper drowsy with old wine, some other stripling had climbed that worn façade before him and slipped through the secret space and stood triumphantly before some daring, laughing girl who had cast aside for him her veil and her fear of death. What ingenuity, Ryder wondered fleetly, had smuggled in the carpenter for the contrivance? What jewels had gone to the bribing? What lies had been told? What had been the end of it all? Evidently not the discovery of the opening. He hoped, with singular intensity, for the safety of the daring young lovers, that unknown youth whose feet had foreworn the path for his feet, and that dead and gone young girl who had dared anything rather than endure the mortal ennui of those hours behind the veil. These thoughts all went through him like one thought as he stood there, his eyes roving about the dim, shadowy room of old divans and Eastern hangings, and then turning back to the glimmering figure of its mistress. She was staring frankly at him, her eyes boldly curious and examining. They were not dark eyes, he saw now. That had been the impression given by the kohl around them and the black line of the brows penciled into one line. They were yellow eyes, golden and glowing, scornful and lazy-lidded. As she looked at him, these eyes smiled slowly. She was seeing in this lover of her rival a singularly delightful-looking young man, for all his dust and disarray, a slender, bronzed, hardy-looking young man, with dark, disordered hair straying across a white brow, and audacious, eager eyes, in which the fear of death, so lately glimpsed, had left no daunting reflection. Slowly she lifted her hand and with deliberate softness put back that straying hair of his. "Poor boy," she said slowly in English, and then, smiling ruefully, she held out her hands for his inspection. The grime of the bricks had discolored their scented delicacy, and he saw bruised finger-tips and a torn nail. "I'm infernally sorry," he said quickly. Her smile deepened at his look of concern, as he held, a little helplessly, the witnesses of her work of rescue which seemed somehow to stray into his keeping. "It is nothing. But you, poor boy," she said again, in that English of which she seemed naively proud. "If you could give me some water," he suggested, and drank deep with delight the last drop she brought him from an earthen jar. It seemed to wash from his throat the taste of that dust and fear. "I can't begin to thank you," he murmured. "I only wish that I could do something for you." She looked up at him. They were standing close together, their voices cautiously low. "Perhaps, yes, you can." "It's not doing anything for you to save Aimée," he told her. "That's what you are doing for her and for me. But if ever you want me for anything after this, my name is Ryder, Jack Ryder, and you can reach me at the Agricultural Bank." He had a vague vision of some day repaying his enormous debt by assisting this girl, grown tired of her Hamdi, out of this aperture and into a waiting boat. He would do it like a shot, he told himself gladly. He would do anything on God's green earth if only she helped him get Aimée away from that infernal villain. "Jack," she repeated under her breath, and then in her slow English, "I like Jack." "Don't forget it. I'll always come and do anything for you. And if you'll tell me your name—" "Aziza." "Aziza. I'll never forget that. And now, if you'll tell me how I can get to her, and then the best way out." "Why you so hurry?" "Why?" He looked a little blank. "I can't lose a minute. He may be with her." She came a little nearer to him, her head tilting back with a slow, indolent challenge. Gone was the silken mantle that had been about her below stairs, and he saw now that she was a vivid, exotic shimmer of gauzy green against the saffron veil that fell from her henna hair. There was barbaric beauty in her, in the bold, painted face, the bare, gold-banded arms, the slender, sinuous lines, and there was barbaric splendor in the heavy jewels that winked and flashed. It struck Ryder that she was gotten up regardless, in pride, perhaps, on her rival's wedding night? Or had there been some defiant, desperate design upon Hamdi? She did not miss that sudden prolonging of his look upon her. "You like me, yes?" she murmured, and then slipping back into the vernacular, I am not the stupid veiled girl of the seclusion, not forever. I come from the West, the deserts. I have seen the world. Men I know. I danced before them. Not the dances of the Carine cafés," she uttered with swift scorn, "but the dance of the two swords, the dance of the serpents. Men threw the gold from their turbans about my feet when I danced to them, and others, English, French." She broke off, but her eyes told many things. "Then Hamdi," she said slowly, "him I ruled, and his palace. But I have known other things." Closer yet she came to him. Her eyes, golden fires of eyes, were smiling up into his, her scarlet lips gathered in soft, sensual curves. Her whole silken, scented body seemed to slip into his embrace. A bare arm touched his neck, resting heavily. "Sweetheart," she said slowly in her difficult English. It was the deuce of a position. No man can rudely snatch from his neck the arm of the lady who has just saved him from a harrowing death, and a lady who is risking more than her life in sheltering him. Decidedly, the situation was delicate. It was not the lady's fault that her impetuosity, the impetuosity which had been his salvation, now plunged her into amorous caprice. There were obvious handicaps, moral, social, and ethical, in her upbringing. She was a child of nature, a nature undisciplined, unruly, tempestuous. And even queening over Hamdi and his palace must have offered little diversion to a wild dancing girl, familiar with the excitement of more varied conquest. Ryder was horribly embarrassed. He was visited with a fearful constraint, a chivalrous wish not to hurt her feelings, and a sharp prevision of the danger of offending her. He took the first turn of least resistance. He did not need to bend his head. Their eyes were on a level. He simply kissed her, and she kissed him back. He hated himself for the leap of his blood, and for the puritanical discomfort of his nature. Her arm about his neck was pressing closer. It was the moment for action, and Ryder acted. Very firmly he put his hand upon her hand, withdrew it from its clasp about him, and raised it to his lips. His kiss was respectful gratitude and an abdication of the delights of dalliance. "Good-bye, my dear," he murmured. "Now, if you will show me the way out." Her eyes agleam between half-closed lids, she studied him. It occurred to Ryder that probably never before had her hands been detached and kissed and put away. He must be a phenomenon, an enigma. Then her eyes parted in a faintly scornful smile. "You afraid, you? You want to run?" "I'm horribly afraid," he said earnestly. "I want to get out of here as quick as I can." That was putting, he considered, the very wisest construction upon it. Negligently her gesture reminded him of the opening in the window. "Here you are safe," she murmured in the vernacular, "and the doors are locked." "Yes, but Aimée isn't safe, you know, and I must get her out of here." "Aimée?" In those yellow eyes he caught the flash of capricious resentment at the reminder. Then indifferently she brushed the distraction away. "There is time enough for Aimée. She is not lonely now." "Not lonely?" He shivered at the cold carelessness of her tone. "I must get to her quickly, then." "But it is not safe. A little later." Uncomfortably he tried to infuse his glance with innate innocence and utter lack of understanding. "I shan't hurt him if I have the chance," he told her. "I've given you my word." "And I trust you much." Her gaze sought his in a trifle of impatience at such simplicity. "But it is not safe for you now. Later. By and by." "You don't want him to have a chance to make love to her, do you?" said Ryder sharply. "I thought that was the very thing you didn't—" Her smile was a subtle, confessing caress. "I shall have my revenge," she murmured, and pressed closer to him again, every sensuous, sumptuous line of her a challenge and an enticement. "I give you life," she whispered very low in her throat. "You give me, perhaps, an hour?" "I haven't an hour," said Ryder very desperately and unhappily. "Not when Aimée is with that devil." It took every thought of Aimée to get the words out. He felt a brute about it, a low, ungrateful dog. She had given him life, and every fiber in him clamored to save her pride and champion her caprice. It seemed so dastardly to wrench away from her now, like some self-centered Joseph, leaving that beastly stab in her vanity. And she was a stunning creature, lawless, elemental, hot and cold like the seventh wind of the inferno. But it was Aimée who was in his blood like a fever. Aimée, that frail white rose of a girl, in her bonds of terror. He saw the flame in Aziz's eyes. He saw the stiffening of her defiance, of half-incredulous affront. Then, her form drawn up, her bared arms outflung, her vivid, painted, furious face challenging him. "I am not beautiful like Aimée?" she said in a voice of venom, and in the English for double measure. "You not like me, no?" "You are beautiful, and I do like you," Ryder combated, feeling a bungling fool, and then went on to thrust into that half-second of suspended fury a faint breath of appeasing. "But don't you see, it's my duty." "You go," she said clearly. Even in that moment he had a sharp prescience of the unwisdom of his rejection. A cold calculator of chance and probabilities would have reckoned that a half-hour of assuagement here would have been a wiser investment of his mortal moments than any virtuous plunge into single-hearted duty. But Ryder did not calculate. He could not, with Aimée under that beast's hand. His heart and soul were possessed with her danger, and his heart and soul carried his body instinctively back from the dancing girl's advance, and he whispered, "I must go. There is no time." She flung back her fiery-hued head with a gesture of intolerable rage. Her eyes were lightnings. "Dog of a Christian!" she said chokingly, and flew to the doors. Back she thrust the heavy hangings, turning a quick key in the lock and wrenching the door wide. And before Ryder could understand, before he could bring himself to realize that she was not simply violently expelling him from her room, she gave a shriek that rang wildly down the long unseen corridors. At the top of her lungs, with one hand out to thrust him back or cling to him if he attempted to pass, she shrieked again and again. Instantly there came a running of feet. Chapter 19. An Interruption. When Hamdi Bey had taken Aimée back to her apartments, he pulled sharply upon a bell cord. In a few moments the slave woman Fatima made her appearance, no kindly-eyed old crone like Miriam, but a sallow, furtive-faced creature with an old disfiguring scar across the cheek. The general pointed to the wet and fainting girl huddling weakly upon the divan. "Your new mistress has met with an accident out boating. A curse upon me for gratifying forbidden caprice," he said crisply. "Be silent of this, and array her quickly in garments of rest. I will return." Very hurriedly he took himself and his own wet condition away. He was furious through and through. What a night! What a wedding night! Scandal and frustration, a bride with a desperate lover, a bride who, herself, drew revolvers and threatened. It was beyond any old tale of the palace. For less, girls had had his father's dagger driven through their hearts. His grandfather, at a mere whisper from a eunuch, had given his favorite to the lion. The whisper was found incorrect at a later, too late date, and the eunuch had furnished the lion another meal. His modern leniency in this case would have outraged his ancestors. But it was not in the bey's nature to deal the finishing stroke to anything so soft and lovely as Aimée. He had no intention of depriving himself of her. If she were red with guilt he would feign belief in her, to save his face until his infatuation was gratified. But actually he did not believe in any great guilt of hers. Tewfik Pasha, for all his indulgent modernity, would keep too strict a harem for that. What he rather believed had happened was that the young American, now so happily immured in his masonry, had become aware of the girl through the story of her French father, and in that connection had struck up the clandestine and romantic correspondence which had led to their mutual infatuation and his desperate venture there that afternoon. The young man had been dealt with, and the thought of the very summary and competent way he had been dealt with drew the fangs from the bite of that night's invasion. His fury felt soothingly glutted. He had been a match for them both, He recalled his own subtlety and agility with a genuine smile as he exchanged his dripping uniform for more informal trousers and a housecoat. He had taught that young man a lesson, a final and ultimate lesson, and he was beginning to teach one to that girl, before he was done with her. He felt for her a mingled passion for her beauty and a lust for conquest of her resistant spirit that fed every base and cruel instinct of his nature. A find, a rare find, even with her circumvented lover. He would have his sport with her, but though he promised this to himself with feline relish, apprehension and chagrin were still working. The fond fatuity with which he had welcomed that starry-eyed little creature had been rudely overthrown, and his pride smarted at the idea of the whispers that might echo and re-echo through his palace. He was too wise an old hand to flatter himself that it would preserve its bland and silent unawareness of this night. So far, he believed, he had been unobserved. In Yusuf's silence he had absolute confidence. But of course there were 100 other chances, some spying backstairs eye, some curious, straining ear. And for this matter of the boating mishap, he cursed himself now, as he combed up his fair mustaches and settled a scarlet fez upon his thin thatch of graying hair, cursed himself roundly for his malicious resort to that old oubliette. Anything else would have done to frighten and overwhelm her, and yet he had gratified his dramatic itch, and now had paid for it with that idiotic story of the boating expedition. He had reason to trust Fatima. There was history behind the old sword scar upon her cheek, and he had a hold over her through her ambition for a son. But Fatima was a woman, and she, or some other, who would see that drenched satin, would be curious of that boating story. And, of course, they could find out from the boatman. It occurred to him to go and see the boatman and order him away, so that afterward the man could say he had been sent off duty, and the story of a nocturnal river trip would not appear too incredible. It was a small concession to stop gossip's mouth. So, drawing on a swinging military cloak, the general stole down through the stair of the water entrance into the lower hall, where the pale light gleamed through the cross-barred iron of the gate, and the gatekeeper slept like a log in his muffling cloak. The soundness of that slumber, loudly attested by the fumes of wine, afforded the general a profound pleasure. He took the man's keys softly, and went to the gate. It afforded him less pleasure to observe that the gate was unlocked, but he put this down to the keeper's muddle-headedness. Carefully he turned the lock and pocketed the keys, for a lesson to the man's overdeep sleep in the morning, and to attest his own presence there that night. Then he went back and brought out an oar which he placed conspicuously beside the smallest boat, drawn up just within the gates. He was afraid to alter the boat's position, lest the noise should prove too wakening, but he considered he had laid an artistic foundation for his story, and with a gratifying sense of triumph he mounted the stairs. He was not conscious of fatigue. He had always been a wiry, indefatigable person, and the alarms and emotions of this night had cleared his head of its wines and drowsiness. He felt the sense of tense, high-strung power which came to him in war, in fighting, in any element of danger. Youth! He snapped his fingers at it. Youth was buried in his masonry and helpless in its shuttered room. Power was master. Power, craft, subtlety. But his elation ebbed as he crossed again that long drawing-room with its faded flowers about the marriage throne, and its abandoned table with its cloth askew, its crystal disarrayed, its candles gutted and spent. The memory of that insolent moment when a man's hand had gripped him, had whirled him from Aimée, when a man's voice and gun had threatened him, that memory was too overpowering for even his triumph over the invader to lay wholly its smart of outrage. He felt again the tightening of his nerves, like quivering wires, as he crossed the violated reception-room and entered the boudoir. It was empty, but on the divan the flickering candlelight revealed the damp, spreading stain where Aimée's drenched satins had been. He thrust aside a hanging and pushed open the door into the room beyond. It was a small bedroom, evidently very recently furnished in new and white shining lacquer of French design, elaborately inlaid with painted porcelains and draped with a profusion of rosy taffeta. Among this elegance, surprisingly unrelated to the ancient panelled walls, stood the hastily opened trunk and bags of the bride, their raised lids and disarranged trays heaped with the confusion of unaccustomed, swiftly searching hands. Aimée herself, in a gay little French boudoir robe of jade and citron, sat huddled in a chair, like a mute, terrified child, in the hand of her dresser, who was shaking out the long, damp hair and fanning it with a peacock fan. At the bay's entrance Fatima suspended the fanning, but with easy familiarity exhibited the long ringlets. Curtly the bay nodded, and gestured in dismissal. The woman laid down her fan, and with a last slant-eyed look at the strangely still new mistress she went noiselessly out a small service door. With an air of negligent assurance, Hamdi Bey gazed about the room and yawned. "Truly a fatiguing evening," he remarked in his dry, sardonic voice. "But you look so untouched. What a thing is radiant youth!" He sauntered over to her, who drew a little closer together at his approach, and lifted one of the long dark curls that the serving woman had exhibited. "The ringlets of loveliness," he murmured. "You know the old saying of the Sadi? The ringlets of the lovely are a chain on the feet of reason and a snare for the bird of wisdom. How long ago he said it, and how true today. Yet such a charming chain. Suppose, then, I forgive you, little one, since sages have forgiven beauty before." She was silent, her eyes fixed on him with the silent terror with which a trapped bird sees its captor, in their bright darkness the same mute apprehension, the same filming of helpless despair. Ryder was dead, she thought. This cruel, incensed old madman had killed him, for all his oaths. Somewhere beneath those ancient stones he was lying drowned and dead, a strange, pitiable addition to the dark secrets of those grim walls. He had died for her sake, and all that she asked now of life, she thought, in the utter agony of her youth, was death, and very quickly. "I am so soft-hearted," he sighed, still with that ringlet in his lifted hand, his hand which wanted palpably to settle upon her, and yet was withheld by some strange inhibition of those fixed, helpless eyes. "Who knows? Perhaps I may forgive you yet. You might persuade me." "He is dead," she said shiveringly. "Dead? He? Ah, the invader, the intruder, the young man who wanted you for a family in France." The bey laughed gratingly. "No, I assure you he is not dead. I have not harmed a hair of his head. He is alive, only not with quite the widest range of liberty." He broke off to laugh again. "Ah, you disbelieve?" he said politely. "Shall I send, then, for some proof? An ear, perhaps? Or a little finger, still very warm and bleeding, to convince you? In 5 minutes it will be here." Then terror stirred again in her frozen heart. If Ryder were alive and still in this man's power. "You are horrible," she said to him in a voice that was suddenly clear and unshaken. "What is it you want of me? Fear and hate and utter loathing?" Her unexpected spirit was briefly disconcerting. The Turk looked down upon her in arrested irony, and then he smiled beneath his mustaches and bent nearer with kindling gaze. "Not at all like that, little dove with talons. I want sweetness and repentance and submission and—" "You have a strange way to win them," she said desperately. "You have taken a strange way with me, my love. Little did I foresee, when I escorted you up the stairs this morning—" He broke off. "There are men," he reminded her, "who would not consider a cold bath as a complete recompense for your bridal plans." She was silent. "But I," he murmured, "I am soft-hearted." He dropped on one knee before her and tried to smile into her averted face. "I can never resist a charming penitent. I assure you I am pliability itself in delicate fingers, although iron and steel to a threatening hand. If you should woo me very sweetly, little one—" She could not overcome, and she could not hide from his mocking eyes, the sick shrinking that drew her back from his least touch, but she did fight down the wild hysteria of her repugnance, so that her voice was not the trembling gasp it wanted to be. "How can I know what you are?" she told him. "You mock me. You threaten to torture that man. It would be folly not to think that you are deceiving me. If you would only prove to me so that I could believe—" "If you would but prove to me so that I could believe. Prove that you are mine, and not that infidel's. Prove that you bring me a wife's devotion, not a wanton's indifference." He caught her cold hands, trying to draw her forward to him. "Prove that you only pity him," he whispered, "but that your love will be mine." She felt as if a serpent clasped her, and yet, if that were the only way to win Ryder's safety, if it were possible for her sickened senses to allay this bad man's suspicions and undermine his revenge. Quiveringly she thought that to save Ryder she would go through fire. But the hideous, mocking uncertainties, her utter helplessness, her lost deference. It was not a sudden sound that broke in upon them, but rather the perception of many sounds, muffled, half-heard, but gaining upon their consciousness, running feet, a stifled voice, something faint and shrill. Aimée sprang to her feet. The general rose with her, and turned his head inquiringly in the direction. Then he jerked open the door through which Fatima had disappeared. It led to a dark service corridor and a small anteroom, from whose bed the attendant was absent. An outer door was ajar. No need to question the sounds now. Faint but piercingly shrill shrieks were sounding from above, while the footsteps were racing, some down, some up. The bey flung shut the door behind him and hurried towards the confusion. Chapter 20. Beyond the Door. Ryder had stood stock still with amazement when the girl began to scream. She had gone mad, he thought for an instant, in masculine bewilderment, and then her madness revealed its treacherous cunning, for she began crying wildly for help against an invader, an infidel, a dog of a Christian who had stolen into her rooms. She had chucked him to the lions, Ryder perceived. One furious flash of lightning jealousy and oriental anger had overthrown in that wild and lawless head every other design for him for which she had risked so much. He had scorned her, he had flouted her caprice, he had dared to refuse the languors of those dangerous eyes. The hurrying footsteps appeared to him the tread of a legion in action, and he had no desire to rush out upon the oncomers. He had, indeed, distinct doubts of his ruthless ability to pass that supple, clawing, incensed creature at the door. He whirled and made a bolt for the window, striking at the fastened grille. He heard the snapping of wooden bolts and the splintering of wood, and out through the hole he climbed to a precipitous, headlong flight that fairly felt the clutching hands upon his ankle. He had meant to make a jump for it. A 3-story plunge into the Nile appeared a gentle exercise compared to the alternative within the palace, but in the very act of releasing his hold he changed his mind. Quicker than he had ever moved before, in any vicissitude of his lithe and agile youth, he clambered up, not down, and crouching back from sight upon the jutting top of the window, he sent his coat sailing violently through space. He dared not look over for its descent upon the water, for other heads were peering from below, and he could hear an excited outburst of speech that broke sharply off. Evidently they were hurrying down to the water gate. Swiftly he utilized this misdirection for his own ends. The roofs, that was the refuge to make for, flat, long-reaching roofs, from which one could climb off onto a wall or a palm or a side street. He had only a story to ascend, and he made it in record time, fearful that the searchers whom he heard now launching a boat below would turn their eyes skywards. But he gained the top without an outcry being raised, and found himself upon the roof where the ladies of the harem took their air, unseen of any save the blind eyes of the muezzin in the Sultan Mosque upon the hill. There were the divans and a little taboret or two and a framework where an awning could be raised against the sun. There was also a trap-door. And here, tempestuously, he changed his mind again. He abandoned the goal of outer walls and chances of escape. He wrenched violently at that trap-door. It was bolted, but the bolt was an ancient one, and gave at his furious exertions, letting him down into a narrow spiral staircase between walls. Down he plunged in haste, before some confused searcher should dash up. It was no place to meet an opposing force, nor was the corridor in which he found himself much better. It was black and baffling as a labyrinth, with unexpected turnings, and he kept gingerly close to the wall, with one hand clutching a bit of iron which he had taken into his possession and his pocket when Aziza had led him out of the underground walls, the very bit of pointed iron it was with which the volatile creature had effected his rescue. He considered it an invaluable souvenir, and twice, in his nervous apprehension, he almost brought it down upon shadows. Direction he judged vaguely by the screaming which was still going on at a tremendous rate. Evidently the girl had gone off into genuine hysterics, or else she had determined not to leave her agitation at the intrusion in any manner of question. No doubt the outcries were a relief to her mingled emotions. Remorse at her impetuosity, and chagrin at her thwarted plans might conceivably be now among those emotions, and since the vicinity of those shrieks must be a gathering place to be avoided by him, he stole on, down the upper hall, and finding a stair, he went down for 2 continuous flights. Aimée's rooms, he knew, had been upon the water, and recalling the general direction of those 2 lighted windows that he had seen so recently from without, his excavator's instinct led him on. Once he saw the flitting figure of a turbaned woman in time to draw back into a heaven-sent niche, and again he flattened into a soundless shadow against the wall as two young serving girls ran by on slippered feet, their ankles tinkling, chattering to each other in delighted excitement. And then the stealthy opening of a door. It was the very door by which Yusuf had precipitated himself upon the struggle at the supper table some age-long hours ago, gave him a glimpse into the far glooms of the reception-room, where its long side of mashrubiyeh windows revealed now between its fretwork tiny chinks of a paling sky. He could make out the dark-draped marriage throne and the pallor of the disordered cloth upon the abandoned table below, and behind the table the dark draperies of the remaining portières before the doorway into the boudoir where he had hidden himself and into which he had last seen Aimée thrust. At the other end of the great room were the entrance stairs to the harem, and there, he imagined, a watchman was stationed, or else stout bolts and bars were guarding the situation. There remained an arched doorway into other formal rooms through which he had seen Aimée and the guests disappear for the wedding supper, and that way led, he surmised, down into the service quarters. A sorry choice of exits! He could form no plan in advance, but trust blindly to the amazing chances of adventure, and first, before he rushed for escape, there was Aimée to find. Yet, for all the mad hazard of the situation, he was elated with life. He felt as if he had never fully lived until now, when every breath was informed with the sharp prescience of danger. He was at once cool and exultant, wary yet reckless, with the joyous recklessness of utter desperation. With cat-like care he surveyed the drawing-room. It appeared deserted, but as he watched his tense nerves could see the shadows forming, taking furtive, crouching shape, and then dissolving harmlessly into a rug, a chair, or a stirring drapery. His eyes grown used to the dimness, he identified the mantle upon the floor in which he had come, and which he had extended to Aimée in that brief moment of fatuous triumph, and beyond it, across a chair, was the portière which the black had torn down from the doorway to wrap about Ryder's helpless form as he had carried him down to living death. That mantle, he thought, might yet be useful, and he stole forward and recovered it, but as he straightened, another shadow darted out from the boudoir door, and silhouetted for an instant against the lighted room he saw a figure in a long, swinging military cloak. Discovery was inevitable, and Ryder made a swift plunge to take the cloaked figure by surprise, but even as one hand shot out and gripped the throat, while the other held his threatening iron aloft, his clutch relaxed, his arm fell nervelessly at his side. For from the figure had come the broken gasp of a soft voice, and the face upturned to his was a pale oval under dark, disordered hair. "Aimée!" he breathed in exultant, still half incredulous joy. "Aimée, did I hurt you?" "Oh, no, no!" came Aimée's shaken voice. "Oh, you are safe!" He felt her trembling in his clasp, and he swept her close to him. For one breathless instant they clung together, in a sharp, passionate gladness which blurred every sense of dread or danger. They were safe, they were together, and for the moment it was enough. Every obstacle was surmounted, every terror conquered. They clung obliviously like children, her pale face against his shoulder, her hair brushing his lips, her wild heartbeats throbbing against his own. Then the girl, remembering, lifted her head. "Quick, we must go," she whispered, "for there I made a fire." He followed her frightened, backward glance at the boudoir door, and suddenly saw its cracks and keyhole strangely radiant with light. "He left me to go to those screams," she was saying rapidly. "I tried to run that way, and found that woman coming back, and I told her to wait in her own room, and I slipped back in there, and suddenly it came to me to thrust the candle about. I thought I would run out, and if I met anyone I would call fire, and say the general was burning, and perhaps in the confusion—" The terrible desperation of her both stirred and wrung him. She was so little, so helpless, so trembling in his clasp, so made for love and tenderness, and to think of her in such fear and horror that she went thrusting reckless candles into her hangings, setting a palace on fire in the blind fury for escape. To such work had this night brought her, this night and 3 men, for he and the craven Tewfik and the fanatic bey were all linked in this night's work. Yes, and another man, and he thought swiftly, in a lightning flash of wonder, how little that Paul Delcassé had known when he set his eager face toward the old world, with his wife and baby with him, that he was setting his feet into such a web, that his wife would die, languishing in a pasha's harem, and his little daughter would one night be flying in mad terror from the cruel beast the weak pasha had sold her to. And how little, for that matter, he had known, when he had set his own face toward those same sands, what secrets he would discover there and what forbidden ways his heart would know. These thoughts all went through him like one thought, in some clear, remote background of his mind, while he was swiftly drawing on the military cloak she gave him, and wrapping her in the black mantle. There was a veil on the mantle's hood that she could fling across her face when she wished, but Ryder had no fez to complete the deceptive outline of his masquerade. He must trust to the dark and to the concealment of the high military collar of the cloak. "Do you know a way?" he whispered, and at her shaken head. "The water gate," he said, thinking swiftly. There would be a crowd now about the gate, but if they could only manage to gain those cellars and hide somewhere, they could steal out later upon that waterman. It seemed the most feasible of all the desperate plans. The roofs might be a trap. The harem entrance led into a garden, and the garden was guarded by an impassable wall. But if he could only get to the river, he knew that he was a strong enough swimmer to save Aimée, or he might even terrorize the watchman into furnishing a boat. She did not question, but guided him swiftly through the arch that led down into the banqueting hall. Twice that day she had gone down those stairs, once in her bridal state, her eyes shining, her cheeks glowing, with the wild joy of Ryder's arrival and dreams of escape. And again, scarcely an hour gone by, she had descended them, tense and desperate, her revolver at the general's head, seeking vainly Ryder's rescue. And now, a third time, a guilty, reckless fugitive in the night, she stole down those stairs into the many-columned hall where she had been feted in state among her guests. Here her only knowledge was of the stone corridor and the locked door through which the bey had led her, but Ryder knew the way that Aziza had brought him, and he turned cautiously towards those wide, curving stairs. Keeping Aimée a few steps behind him, he went down the soft carpet and peered out at the bottom towards the water gate. He saw no bars. The gate was open, and against the pale square of the water were the black silhouettes of the general and the gateman, both leaning out at some splashing in the river. He knew a boy's reckless impulse to shove them both in. It was an unholy thought his better judgment rejected, unless driven to it, yet some prankish element in his roused recklessness would not have deplored the necessity. If they looked about. But they did not stir as, with Aimée's cold hand in his, he made the tiptoe descent, and slipped softly about the corner of the steps. Then, instead of going on down the hall to some hiding place in the ruins, he took a suddenly revealed, sharper turn into a narrow passage just beyond the stairs. It might lead to another gate, some service entrance perhaps. It ran so straight and direct between its walls. Intuitively that excavator's sense of his defined the direction. They were going parallel with the river, although a little way back from the water wall, and in the direction of the men's part of the palace, the Selamlik. He recalled the Selamlik vaguely as an irregular mass of buildings, and though the formal entrance was of course through the garden from the avenue, there was a narrow side street or lane leading back to the water's edge between this part of the palace and the Nest building, and very likely there was some entrance on that lane. Bitterly he blamed himself for his lack of complete inspection that morning. To be sure, he had told himself then, as he strolled about the high garden walls and peered down the narrow lane on one side of the Nile backwaters, that he didn't need a map of the place for his arrival at an afternoon reception. He was simply going in and out, and clothes and speech were his only real concern. He had even said to himself that he might not reveal himself to Aimée, if she did not discover him. He wanted merely to see her again, and be sure that she understood her own history. He had no notion of attempting any further relations with her, any resumption of their forbidden and dangerous acquaintance. And it was true that had been the defiant and protesting surface of his thoughts, but deep within himself there had always been that hot, hidden spark, ready to kindle to a flame at her word, and with it the unowned, secret longing that she would speak the word. And when she had called on him for help, when the trembling appeal had sprung past her stricken pride, and he had seen the terror in her soft child's eyes, then the spark had struck its conflagration. He had become nothing but a hot, headstrong fury of devotion. And he said to himself now that he might have known it was going to happen, and that if he had not been so concerned that morning about saving his face and preserving this fiction of indifference, he would know a little more about the labyrinth they were poking about in, the little more that tips the scale between safety and destruction. But he did not know, and blind chance was his only goddess. The passage had brought him to a wall and a narrow stairs, while another passage led off to the right, apparently to the forward regions of the place. He took the stairs. He had had enough of the underground regions when they did not lead to water gates, and the stairs promised novelty at least. He wished he knew more about Turkish palaces. He supposed they had a fairly consistent ground plan, but beyond a few main features of inner courts and halls, he was culpably ignorant of their intentions. If it were an early Egyptian tomb or temple now, but then perhaps the Turks were more indefinite in their building and rebuilding. At the head of the stairs a door stood half ajar. Through the crack he strained his eyes, but his anxious glance met only the darkness of utter night. Not a gleam of light, and not a sound, except the far, hollow stamping of some stabled horse. Slowly he pushed the door open, and he and Aimée slipped within. The place, whatever it was, appeared deserted, a dark, bare, back-stairs region, for he stumbled over a bucket, from which to the right he could just discern a hall leading into the forward part of the palace, wanly lighted some distance on, with the pale flicker of an old ceiling lamp. They seemed to be at the end of the hall, and the darker shadows in the walls about them appeared to be a number of doors, closed, so his groping hands informed him. Oh, for his excavator's steady light, or a pocket flash! Oh, for a light of any kind, even a temporary match! But he dared not risk the scratch, for now he caught the thud of footfalls overhead, heavy footfalls, and there might be stairs unexpectedly close at hand. He turned to Aimée, but the girl shook her head helplessly, and hesitant and dashed, for all their young confidence, they wavered a moment, hand in hand in the dark, fearful of what a rash move might bring upon them. And in the beating stillness Ryder became conscious that the muffled, monotonous stamping of a horse is a gloomy, disheartening thing in the night, and that footsteps overhead are of all noises the most nervous and unsettling. What was behind those doors? Not a spark of light came from them. That was one comfort. The rooms, kitchen, service, storerooms, or whatever they were, appeared in the same blackness and oblivion, but any door might open on a roomful of sleeping gardeners and grooms. Life, and more than life, hung on the blind goddess. It was only an instant that they hesitated there, yet it appeared an eternity of indecision. Then nearer footsteps sounded, coming down that hall. No more wavering of the scales. Ryder turned to the door at his left, at the very end of the wall, beyond which came that far stamping, and wrenched it open, closing it swiftly behind him. He saw a light now, a mild yellow ray through an open door ahead, that vaguely illumined the strange old vehicles of the palace, and the stables were beyond. Someone else was beyond, too, in the stables. For that very instant he saw a black horse backed restively into sight, its tossing head evading the hands that were trying to bridle it. "The 40th door," said Ryder to himself, with an involuntary thrust of humor. The door of the horse, the door of forbidden daring. He knew now the vague associations that had stirred in him as he had stared blindly about that place of doors. But he had opened so many forbidden doors of late that this last was welcome as the supreme test. And nothing in the world could have been more welcome than a horse with a way out behind it. "Stay back," he said under his breath to Aimée, and clasping his bit of iron, he moved toward the door. He could see the attendant now, who was finishing his bridling, and it was Yusuf, the eunuch, so busy gentling and soothing the horse that he cast only one glance in the direction of the sounds he heard, and that one glance misled him in its glimpse of the general's cloak. "By your favor, but an instant," he called out, "and he is ready." "Stand aside," said Ryder very clearly, emerging from the shadows at the horse's heels. "Out of the way with you. The horse is for me." A moment Yusuf gaped. Then he dropped the bridle, and his hand went swiftly to the knife hilt in his belt. "Fool," said Ryder contemptuously. "Would you tempt fate? Do you think I am such that your knife could harm me? Must I prove to you again that walls are nothings? That I but let myself be taken to prove my powers?" Ethiopians are superstitious, and Yusuf knew that his brick and mortar had been strong. Yet they have great trust in a crooked, short-bladed knife, and Yusuf did not relax his hold upon his, and for all that Ryder could see, there was no hesitation in the grinning ferocity of his black face. Yet his spring was an instant delayed, and in that instant Ryder spoke again. "Look, now, at the wall behind you," he said quickly. Yusuf looked, and as he turned his bullet head, Ryder jumped close and brought his iron down upon it with a sickening force he thought scarcely short of murder. To his amazement, the black did not fall, but staggered only, and Ryder had need to send the knife spinning from his grasp and strike again before the eunuch's knees sagged and his huge bulk sank at Ryder's feet. This time Ryder took no chance with a shammed unconsciousness. He snatched down bits of leather from the wall and bound the man's hands and feet in tight security, and seeing that he was breathing, although heavily, he thrust a gagging handkerchief into his mouth. Then he dragged the heavy body towards a pile of hay he saw in a vacant stall, and concealed it effectively but not too smotheringly, although Yusuf, he felt, would be no grievous loss to society. Vaguely in the back of his consciousness he had been aware of the excited plunge of the horse, and then of a low, soothing murmur of speech, and now he turned to find Aimée holding the bridle and stroking the quivering creature with gentle, fearless hands. "Is he dead?" she asked quietly of the eunuch. "Stunned," said Ryder, meaning reassurement, and was startled by the passion of her cry. "Oh, I could kill them all!" "I will, if they try to stop us," he promised grimly, forgetful of that oath to Aziza. Hastily he glanced about the stalls. There was no other horse there, only a pair of mild-eyed donkeys, and though there might conceivably be other horses behind other doors, there was no instant to spare in search. This luck was too prodigious to risk. The door to the street had already been unbolted, and now he threw it back, with a quick look into the dark emptiness of the narrow side street, and then, with a tight hold of the reins, he swung himself into the saddle, and Aimée up into his arms, her head on his shoulder, her arms clasping him. It was a huge Bedouin saddle with high arched back and curved pommel, and the slender pair no more than filled it, making apparently no weight at all for the spirited beast which tore out of the stalls at the charging gallop beloved of Eastern horsemen. For a moment Ryder felt wildly that he might meet the fate of the rash youth in his patron's story. He had never ridden a horse like this, which, like all high-mettled Arabs, resented the authority of any but his master, and though a good horseman, Ryder had all he could do to keep his seat and Aimée in his arms. Around the corner of the lane the horse went racing, and down the dark, lebbek-lined avenue his flying feet struck back their sparks of fire. Across an open square he plunged, while irate camels screamed at him and a harsh voice shouted back loud curses. It seemed to Ryder that other voices joined in, that there was a pursuit, an outcry, and then they were out upon an open road, wildly galloping like a mad highwayman under a pale morning sky.